Look, we're going to go for questions now. What I'm going to propose we do is run this session until 1:15, just to give us a chance for questions, because it is the most important, and then we'll make up the time, still come back at 2 o'clock and take a just slightly shorter lunch break to accommodate that. But I'm going to look to see if there's any questions in the room first before we go online. I believe there's somebody who's just out of my eye line at the moment, but if you could pass the...
Hello. I'm delighted to see that there's two speakers from Wexford on the panel, as I'm from that part of the world myself. No, just a couple of quick points. In relation to, I'm a farmer myself, and I'm not here representing anybody, only myself, but in relation to agriculture, a lot has been said about being environmentally sustainable, which is perfectly reasonable and sensible. But I think unless we ensure that it is economically sustainable, we're not going anywhere. And I think that has to be a priority which must never be ignored, because economic sustainability will ultimately decide whether or not it will work. Because a couple of days ago, I was at a conference where the EU Commissioner stated that there's 1,000 farmers per day leaving agriculture in the European Union. So on that note, I think that's important to bear in mind. In relation to forestry, and I'm not into forestry, but from speaking to people who are in it, I understand one of the major reasons why forestry has almost come to a stop is the complicated planning process, where it is required that you need the planning permission to plant the trees, you need planning permission to thin out the forestry, you need separate planning permission to pin a road, and you need planning permission to harvest the trees. Now, and from the people I have spoken to, they would say that that is a major reason why forestry has come to such a low ebb. And on a smaller scale, I think if there was something to encourage people, I think there's hardly a farm in the country that could easily plant 50 or 100 trees without having any impact on the farm or the output. And I think that if that was encouraged on an overall scale, it would have some significant benefits.
Thanks for those questions. Matt, I might come to you just on that. I think the forestry question in particular, but I suppose that kind of the economic sustainability for farmers, and maybe in a more general sense, kind of the bringing people with you, which I know has been part of the work that you've been doing on the forestry group as well. So you might talk about that for us.
Yeah, no, the forestry area is really, it's interesting from that point of view, because it's just not working at the moment. Like, just to be blunt about it, like the state has had a target of moving to 18% land cover of forestry for over 20 years now. And the levels of new afforestation required to get anywhere close to that are just not happening, you know, and there are many, many barriers and reasons for it. I think the one that was mentioned just by the farmer there from Wexford is a major one. There are regulatory barriers. There are all sorts of reasons, I think, why it's just not happening. So, like, that coupled with the point about like farming has to be economic. The farmer there is absolutely correct, and there are so many issues in relation to charting out a future for rural Ireland where you can see more young people, more women getting involved in farming. How do we envision the future construction of rural Ireland in 10, 20 years time, which will be, a really thriving situation in relation to food production, in relation to forestry, wood production, all the various different things that can happen through the best use of our land. So there's a lot of work has to go on, I think, in this, in terms of reimagining how we use the land. And I think the land use review that the Minister mentioned at the start, and has been mentioned a couple of times, it is really important. Like, that piece of work is the bit of work that will help provide the guidance that I think everybody needs as to what the future of land management might be in Ireland. Like, we know what a lot of the problems are. We've a fairly good idea of what the solutions might be, but it's that bit in the middle of figuring out and co-creating solutions in collaboration with the likes of the farming communities, of local communities, that ultimately, I think, is the bit that we're probably struggling with a bit in Ireland at the moment. But is the bit that is crucially needed, and we need to make quick progress on this stuff as well, you know, to get to the point where we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, there's a big gap there. We have another question in the room, I think.
How you doing? Rory Sheehan, I'm an ecologist. Unfortunately, Matt's going to get hammered with another question here. I've got a specific one, I suppose. In light of the emerging evidence around pine monoculture forestry on peat soils, and for us to achieve our land management to be a net sink for CO2 by 2030, should we harvest or should we cut down the pine forests ahead of maturity or ahead of time and restore the underlying peat soils instead of letting them reach maturity and then harvesting them? So should we put in place an accelerated program of removal of these monoculture pine forests on peat soils?
Thanks for that question, Matt.
Yeah, I'm gonna answer that question in a strange way, because I'm not an expert in forestry. Okay, so I'm not going to get into the detail of the pros and cons of what you mentioned there. But I'm going to bring in another subject which was mentioned earlier, which is house building. So, like, I think the figure that was just mentioned in the last talk there was up to 500,000 new homes are required in Ireland over the next 10 years or so, or 10 to 15 years. We build very few houses in Ireland from wood. Like, compared to Scotland, in Scotland about 80% of new builds are built from timber frame. And mostly from timber that's grown in Scotland. In Ireland, the figure is closer to between 25 and 30%. So there's a huge opportunity if we can get it right in relation to forestry, if we can really work out what the right tree in the right place for the right reasons with the right management really means, which would include addressing your question about the peatland issue. We should be able to get ourselves into a position where, as a country, we're actually able to embody a lot more carbon grown on Irish land in trees, in houses that would be built in the future. So that's just another part of the bigger picture here that we've got to tackle over the next 10 years. And again, to come back to the urgency question, you know, the housing plan that we currently have, it had very little in it actually about building from wood. So again, that's another thing that we need to figure out fairly quickly. How can that be changed? So if we are going to be building an awful lot more houses in Ireland in the next 10 years, why can't we build more of them from wood, and particularly wood grown in Ireland?
Thanks, Matt. I'm going to go to just the online questions just to see if you have any in there, Dervla. Thank you.
Brilliant, yeah. So there's one here that was originally for Paul, but it could be for Paul and then Ken as well, I'd say. So it's just on, are just transition principles included in the planning frameworks and the national growth strategies, and how can we improve on this?
Thanks, Dervla. Paul?
Well, absolutely, they have to be. I think, I think, well, what I talked about was to a certain extent housing. Employment and economic opportunity are very much part of what the framework sets out to facilitate. So, it's in looking at opportunities for rural development in particular, different, I suppose, diversification to a certain extent. Not necessarily out of agriculture, but beyond maybe what traditionally happens in those areas is something that has been identified, and certainly as well as food production, renewable energy production is a particular area identified. And I know other things like tourism, and now we have more opportunity as a result of remote working and things like that. So yes, absolutely, I think in a broad sense, rural development is part of the overall picture, and what rural development looks like in 21st century Ireland is something that has been to a certain extent set out, and will certainly be looked at again when we review the strategy.
Thanks, Paul. Ken, anything to add?
Yeah, just I suppose a couple of minor points just to add to what Paul said. I mean, I think it's clear, even before the NDP, I suppose the government has demonstrated its commitment to just transition with the closure of the two peatlands plants in the Midlands. The government put in place the re-retting programme for Bord na Móna's lands in the Midlands that Brian mentioned a little earlier, and that meant that there were no further job losses then resulting from the closure of those two plants. So I think that's a very tangible commitment. There's also then the through the carbon tax, through the revenue raised by the carbon tax, the government has put in place a domestic Just Transition Fund, which again is providing opportunities. It's funding peatlands rehabilitation through national parks and wildlife in the Midlands. It's also funding retrofit schemes specifically targeted at social homes in the Midlands, again creating that sustainable employment as an alternative in the Midlands. And we're moving on, I suppose, now from the National Just Transition Fund, and we are going to implement our national implementation of the EU's Just Transition Fund as well. And Minister Ryan and his department are in the process of developing our national strategy for the implementation of that fund, which will be published, I believe, in the next couple of months. So I think there's some very tangible demonstrations of the government's commitment to just transition, as well as, I suppose, the principles that are articulated in the National Development Plan, which I suppose what we're really getting at here are the distributional issues that climate change may give rise to, that will arise over the coming decades. I think the government is very cognizant of the need that these will have to be managed and addressed insofar as they can. Thanks.
Thanks, Ken. I think there'll be a good opportunity in the afternoon as well to just think about that just transition question. We're going to be hearing from Padraig Boland from the Laois and Offaly Education Training Board, who has first-hand experience of that just transition in the Midlands. So we'll get to come back to that point. But look, I'm conscious of time and people are probably starving at this stage. So we're going to finish up. So I just would like to very much thank our three speakers on the stage with us, and indeed Matt, who's joined us online. And to thank everybody for their attention and their questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to more of them. We're going to resume at 2 p.m. sharp. We're going to have a 10-minute kind of window beforehand for the online audience to let you know that there's a countdown. But I'd like you finally to just join with me to thank our speakers for today's contribution. Thanks.